Hey there, demons, deities, and devil summoners. Welcome back to what's going to be a bit of a different episode of Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei Game. As you may know, these videos are basically my little corner of YouTube that I've carved out to talk and gush about what I liked and didn't like about various Mega 10 games, and hopefully in the process convince some of you to give it a shot as well. And since this time round we're covering Shin Megami Tensei V, the newest entry in the series and current game to hold the throne of the SMT zeitgeist, it felt a bit redundant trying to sell you on the game when it's already the best-selling game in the franchise and all. So with that all in mind, I took my time with the game, and will instead attempt to make more of a critique than whatever my usual style of video is. That being said, I will warn you that this video will have spoilers for both SMT V and Nocturne in it. All of the SMT V spoilers will have its own section, and any footage that I show that will have any minor things in there, I'll censor out with something. SMT Nocturne, however, I am going to just speak freely about because, I mean, the game's nearly 20 years old at this point. So if you do care about spoilers for these two games still, then I do suggest clicking off the video whenever it's relevant. However, I suggest doing that by clicking on the channel icon below and maybe checking out some of my other videos. Maybe even subscribe while in the process of doing so. It is scientifically proven to make you 17% more attractive to Mothmen after all. Now, with all of that preamble out of the way, let's actually start by talking about Shin Megami Tensei V. And I want to start before even the beginning, specifically during the 2021 E3 showcase, where we finally got our first real look at the game after 3 teaser trailers across a 3-year period. Needless to say, I loved what I was seeing at the time. This was probably the biggest game in scope and scale for the entire Mega 10 series, barring potentially Persona 5. And it looked great, but when I first watched the trailer, a certain other game made by Atlus came to mind, and I thought to myself, wow, these menus really look like Tokyo Mirage Sessions. Although that's not really relevant to this video, but you see, my second thought was, this really reminds me of Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. Not necessarily in terms of tone or aesthetic, I mean, after all Mega 10 games carry very similar vibes across them, but more so in the game's vision. At the time, I was either finished or just wrapping up Nocturne HD for my video review on that game, link in the thingy. And at the time, I was doing a lot of research on the game, making sure I didn't get anything wrong, and also learning little interesting tidbits about the game's development. And one part that really stuck out to me initially due to giving me a good chuckle was that since this was Atlus's first big fully rendered 3D game, one of their ambitions for it was to really take advantage of the new hardware they were using and have the Vortex world tie directly into gameplay. When starting out its development, one of the key aspects of Nocturne was that the Vortex world would be an open, fully explorable Dyson sphere, where every location you could see in the distance would be a place that you could go to, and it would all loop back on itself with how the world is designed. Naturally, that idea was scrapped and just reworked into a concave overworld map once Atlus realized the PS2 wasn't quite the miracle machine they were expecting it to be. Regardless, when playing the game with that knowledge, you can very clearly see exactly what Atlus was going for. And that same vision is something that you can see in Shin Megami Tensei V as well. If there's one thing I want to say about SMT V in this video, is that it feels like Atlus looked back at the old drawing board and said, let's try exactly what we weren't able to do before. Funnily enough, in a very similar way to how Halo Infinite's kind of looked back on Halo 1 and tried to recreate that original concept of a fully explorable Halo ring, even if it's still not quite to the extent they wanted. Something that SMT V wasn't quite able to do as well, but we'll get to that. The thing is it wasn't just that though. The more I saw of SMT V leading up to its release, the more comparisons I started making between it and Nocturne in my mind, be it either big similarities or deliberate polar opposites. I fully expect that some of the things that I noticed are either just coincidence or just general SMT things that I'm just not well enough versed in the series to really pick up on. And maybe I'm just being crazy, but you know what, I had a cool idea for a video thumbnail and I'm not going to give up on it. Also, with this video being so late compared to everyone else's, I think it's worth it looking at it from a different perspective and keeping Nocturne in mind in the process. And hence our subtitle, A Reflection of Chaos, is born. I really hope nobody's done this already, because I try not to watch other people's reviews before making my own. Now, with that second lot of preamble over, good god, these scripts are terrible. Let's start by actually talking about the game. And I want to talk about the previously mentioned world and exploration first, since that is probably the most glaring new aspect in the game compared to the previous titles. Even with all the advancements to technology since 2003, the original dream of Nocturne's fully open map to traverse and explore is still just a pipe dream, at least for a JRPG, and one on Switch no less. But despite that, I think the game still does an excellent job of conveying that vision, even with a limited resource of power. From the moment that you enter Dart and fuse with Aogami, you get this view of Tokyo Tower in the distance, and you can run straight there from your location right to Tokyo Tower with no loading screens or anything. Granted, it's probably just a trick of the eye in a similar sense to how the Dark Souls games will show you what is actually a small model of the level off in the distance, and will load the real version in as you walk through a tunnel or something to get there. And SMT V probably does the same thing while you're walled in by skyscrapers in every direction. But that doesn't actually change how it feels in practice. And this is a feeling that is only elevated after reaching the tower and defeating the Hydra, which you are then greeted with a slope down to an open city block, which as you descend you'll notice more and more demons infesting the landscape, as well as a giant bird flying around in the distance. These areas are all incredibly open and explorable like that original hope for Nocturne, but at the same time also contrast what that game was. SMT V does not carry that same lonely yet dread-filling tone of Nocturne's dark and quiet environment, but instead has several loud and bright hellscapes that you have to wrestle and fight your way to get through. This directly contrasts Nocturne's quiet, desolate tone, where instead of being on the attack, fighting your way through a demon horde, you are simply waiting for whatever lurks in the shadows to jump out and ambush you. You may even say it's a reflection of chaos. Save it for the end, dumbass. What's really important though is, yeah, these areas are big and all, but are they actually fun to explore? And, well, yeah, they are. A lot, actually. Well, most of the time. See, SMT V is the first game in the series to have a dedicated jump button, and honestly, it's surprising how well it's utilized in the game's level design. It allows you to gain access to various nooks and crannies, and while the platforming itself isn't the best feeling, the jump's forward momentum doesn't increase when sprinting, for example, it still adequately does its job of allowing for more interesting locations to hide secrets. Now, please excuse the journalist buzzword here, but the verticality in SMT V is easily one of its greatest strengths. So much so that a lot of the time the 2D map ends up being a little bit useless. Regardless, there is so much stuff packed into these areas, but not in a way that it feels like too much. At least at first. Important things that you definitely don't want to miss, like treasure chest equivalents and glory awarding apples of Eden, are things that are always marked on the map, whilst the less important, at least individually, Korok seed-like Mimons need to be tracked down manually, at least until you buy a map at the end of each area. This results in a gameplay loop that pretty much always rewards exploring and combing through the environment, but also doesn't really punish you for not doing so. I do have some problems with it though, one of which being pretty glaring. It felt like the placement of secrets and such got progressively more and more random as I went through the game. In the earlier areas, you'd have stuff like an overpass bridge going over a road, and you'd think, huh, this is a bit odd that I can walk on these, I bet there's something on one of them, and lo and behold, there is. Whilst in the final area, it felt like Atlus were just dropping Mimons behind rocks and calling it a day at that. In fact, this progressively less inspired placement of secrets is something that can be said of the entire game's level design as well. It seems to deteriorate as the game goes on, and by the final area, it's just a big set of open, empty areas. After 3 different coloured sandy areas with ruined buildings in them, A fourth one really isn't too exciting at the best of times, and they don't really do themselves any favours, especially when the fucking cubes from Nocturne's final dungeon show up again. I hate these cubes so much. It's kind of a shame, since the game starts off so strong, and it just kind of feels like they had a great idea for the first area, and then they decided to build the others around only that design, realizing only later that it kind of starts to lose its luster. I still enjoyed exploring these areas a lot, but by the end of the third area, my mind had already grown accustomed to just sprinting through the area as fast as possible, and then doubling back after the fact to do cleanup. And again, fuck these cubes. At least these ones don't teleport me, I suppose. So, moving on from exploration now, I should probably actually get around to talking about the game's combat, since that's a pretty important aspect of any RPG, but especially for the Mega 10 franchise. And for the most part, there's not a lot new in terms of overall system changes. The press turn system is back with its usual glass cannon promoting exploits, skill affinities make a return from SMT4 and 4 Apocalypse, seemingly a permanent new addition to the series at this point, and the app point system has been reworked into Glory and Miracles. Because of this, the identity of SMT5's combat is kind of determined by multiple small tweaks and changes that build up, so it's really hard to talk about without being super granular and nitpicky. There is one mechanic that I do think stands out slightly more than the rest, and that being the quote-unquote new Magatsuhi Meter. I say quote-unquote since it is basically the SP meter from Tokyo Mirage Sessions, albeit just reworked a bit to have an actual impact on average gameplay and not just once in a blue moon. The Magatsuhi gauge will fill up a little bit after each turn or under specific other conditions as you progress through the game, such as nullifying attacks and guarding. Once it's full, you have access to various skills and buffs that last for the turn depending on the race of demons that you are currently using. The default Magatsuhi skill that the protagonist has is one that you always have and will probably always use, being a party-wide buff that lasts the turn that makes all hits a critical hit, including magic attacks. This skill in particular is always really fun to use. It is a simple, clean, easy power trip that you can activate pretty regularly. And every enemy in the game also has access to this ability, albeit with a telegraphed charge-up animation on the turn before. My problem with it is it's a little bit too overpowered, and it's also a game mechanic that is deliberately skewed towards the player. I think what makes the press turn system stand out to me so much is that it's busted as crap once you start exploiting it. But the enemy is fighting on the exact same terms as you. In fact, with some bosses getting more than one press turn for themselves, it's arguable that it favours them more. The Magatsuhi Meter, on the other hand, has a very specific bias towards the player. Oma Katoki critical aside, the player already has a much bigger variety of different skills that they can use. So right off the bat, it's already favouring the player. Now add Oma Katoki critical to the mix, and all of a sudden you've got a really overpowered skill that guarantees higher damage on all of your attacks, as well as giving you 8 press turns, providing you don't heal or something. With the right team composition, this is a really good recipe for just one-rounding bosses. The enemies, on the other hand, while they do technically have that same move, it's got a lot of drawbacks that the player doesn't have to put up with. For starters, there is that telegraphed aspect where they'll signify when they're going to use it next turn. While this is definitely something that I don't think should be removed, since giving the enemies just more ways to one-shot you on a whim is definitely not very fun, I think the player's version of it should be nerfed in some sort of shape or form to bring it a bit closer to the enemy's version. Either make it like the enemy's version, so it needs that one-turn delay as well, or make it actually use a press turn, so you only get a guaranteed 6 or 7 depending on how you use it. It would still be a really powerful weapon in your toolset, but I think it would give all of the other abilities a little bit more room to breathe as well. Because that's the other problem with it. I 100% get that the default ability for this system needs to be something that you can use in pretty much any situation. However, it really feels like it's the move that you're supposed to use in every situation. I'm pretty sure I only used like 3 or 4 other Magatsuhi moves, and 2 of those times I remember regretting using them because it just wasn't worth it. That all being said, I do really love the design of this mechanic in concept. Earning new ways to increase the meter as you progress through the game really makes you start to interact with the combat in different ways than you'd probably would do in other SMT games. Moving on to some of the even more nitpicky stuff, I think the most controversial change is the change to the buffs and debuffs. SMT V does away with the traditional SMT style of buffs where you can stack it multiple times and it will always affect the whole party. This time round, it's been changed to a more standard RPG buffing system of each buff lasting for 3 turns and they can be stacked twice. And they've also implemented single target buffs for the early game as well. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this change since I feel like the old buffing system was one of the very uniquely SMT things. It gave the combat in things like Soul Hackers and Nocturne a very different flow to most RPGs. So seeing it gone does make me a little bit sad, but at the same time I don't think it's a huge detriment to the game. It still works perfectly fine. And at the end of the day, it's always important to try new things to keep the gameplay fresh. And while I'm complaining about things, I might as well get my biggest gripe with the game's combat out of the way. And that is what I think is the most important stat in the game. Now, you may think by this I mean something like Fizz builds are more OP compared to magic ones. Looking at the stat screen, I can tell you that all of these numbers are really not that important until the later parts of the game. And the most important stat is this one. Sure, leveling up in an RPG is always important since it's used to raise these other numbers, your stats. But in SMT, it feels like it takes your level into account when calculating damage. And maybe this is a thing in every SMT game. I know it certainly exists in the Personas to at least some extent, but the difference with SMT 5 is I feel like the level scaling on damage is way too high. With the potential of a demon like Alice, who has an attack stat of about 2, dealing more damage than a demon like Rakshasa, who has about 20 attack, just because she's 20 or so levels higher than him. My problem with this system is that, for starters, it means that the stats kind of just straight up lie to you. They're not all that important until you get to like the very end game. But it also just incentivizes simply grinding a bit to get out of a challenge. I really liked things in Nocturne where, like, when you fought Matador, he'd be very tough. But if you made a correct build around him, you could beat him. Alternatively, you could level up a bit, and you wouldn't necessarily be that much stronger to fight him, but you'd have the ability to fuse a Nekomata who would nullify wind, which would make him significantly easier. The difference between the two being that one method is simply just making your numbers higher, while the other is unlocking a new option to try and deal with him that is significantly better than building your team around when you didn't have it. I saved all of the free demon level up statues in the second area for later use, and upon hitting the difficulty spike in the third area, I went back and power leveled my party about 6 or 7 levels higher than me. And from just that, I could just ignore every enemy in the third area because my party was untouchable at that point. Something that I believe is worth mentioning that I like quite a bit, however, is the mild changes to the press turn system, particularly when passing turns. Before, when passing twice in a row, you'd spend half a turn doing the first pass, and then on the second pass, you'd use that half turn up. In SMT 5, however, you'll instead use 2 half turns instead of halving a turn and then using the rest of it. This is a very minor change, and it does technically take a little bit out of the situational depth of the press turn system, but I think the payoff of making the press turn system itself a little less cumbersome to use properly is a much bigger gain, especially for newer players, as it actively encourages engaging with the press turn system the way that you're supposed to, so stuff like passing actually feels like a much more viable option in SMT 5. Now, I know I'm being really granular and nitpicky about these things, but that's because a lot of SMT 5's combat is stuff that I could say about SMT 3 and SMT 4 and pretty much any of the other press turn combat games. Even playing a modern Persona game, you'll know what a Buffalat is, you'll know what a Zeodyne is. I don't need to really explain these things to you if you're watching this video above anybody else's. And I think that's a very interesting point. You see, SMT5 really feels like it is a continuation, a refinement of pretty much everything that's come after its chaotic older brother. When SMT3 first released, it innovated a ton on the pre-existing conventions of the series and ended up setting the foundation for the next 20 plus years to come. SMT5 as it currently stands is the exact opposite of that, where it's changed no conventions, it's taken a little bit of pretty much every game that's come before it and tried to refine it and put it all into one big package. Not that I think that's a bad thing, of course, like I do genuinely enjoy SMT5's combat flow. I just think it's interesting how this is another example of how the game mirrors Nocturne. And like any reflection, while many parts of it are the same, there are certain aspects of it that are actually the opposite. I do, however, feel like while it is a refinement and a bunch of tweaks to the gameplay systems of SMT over the years, I also think it wasn't quite enough. I think the sign of a good JRPG combat system is to have one that is malleable enough that even the most toughest fights in the entire game can be made trivial with enough prep and planning, and seeing people with review codes throw themselves at the Demi-Fiend for a week, going from no one can beat him, even on easy, to so this is me beating him in 2 turns on hard, it kind of proved to me that SMT5's core combat is a really good RPG system just ready to be broken, especially with like a plethora of new skills like naturally piercing magic attacks or Bowl of Hygienia, that while are all just single additions, I think do benefit the game a lot in just adding more and more different options during combat. At the end of the day, fans have turned these older games inside out and they know their way through them so easily. So stuff like these new skills do a ton to really help keep the game fresh and open up new routes for what you can do. My problem with it is that while this is all there, mindlessly brute forcing your way through the game is still probably the easiest option. Outside of the very, very end game, I really don't feel like you need to think about what you're doing in battles whatsoever. And I'm not saying, oh, my SMT games need to be hard and brutally difficult, because if I was, then I could have just carried on playing on hard mode. It's just that the combat system has quite a lot of depth to it, and you get to see that potential really shine in the late game stuff. It's just that that's really only like the final 10, maybe even final 5% of the entire game, and with the rest of it, that just doesn't really need to be the case. Now, that all being said, I will admit that the brute force argument is probably a lot less apparent to newer players. I've not played a huge number of SMT games yet, but I've played a good chunk of them, and each one I've spent a fair amount of time in those games engaging in long fusion sessions, so I know what works with what, which is why, for personal reasons, I both love and hate the Essence system. I absolutely adore how easy and convenient it is to create demons with skill sets that you want for them. Do you want Finn McCool to have both high Fizz Plumora and Fizz Plumora? Just pump the appropriate essences into him and boom, you've got a physical killing machine. This is a great addition to the game, much in the same way that picking skills during fusion was when it was added. What I hate about this mechanic is how much power it gives me specifically. I no longer have to spend an evening in the fusion mines making sure I get that perfect demon that I want. You see, I'm a crazy person, and because of that, one of my favourite parts of a Mega 10 game is during the late game, I like to become one of the Blue Man group and spend hours sitting in either the Velvet Room or the Cathedral of Shadows or whatever it might be, and spending hours getting lost creating some broken monstrosity. However, I didn't do that this time, like at all. I didn't need to. Granted, I haven't made any real attempts at Demi-Fiend yet, so I imagine if I did, then I would need to do this sort of stuff. But I have beaten pretty much every other challenge SMT5 has to throw at me just by cooking up whatever I could on the go and making little improvements to demons here and there. And with all of that, I was able to take out Shiva, the game's non-DLC super boss, and I even one-turned, granted after buffs, the game's true final boss. It feels really weird looking at a system that I see as a genuine improvement to the series and being like, I hate it. And before anyone says, well, Kraft, you choose how you engage with the game, you don't have to use them. Yeah, you're right, I don't have to use them. But you know what? I don't want to. Now, after that sizable rant of gameplay gripes and opinions, it's probably about time I get back on topic and start linking back to that subtitle of mine again. When it comes to the more JRPG side of things, I think the most obvious similarity between SMT5 and Nocturne is just how you build your Nahaobino and Demi-Fiend. Something that both games share that isn't the most common thing in JRPGs is the lack of any form of equipment. Both games are stripped down to the absolute core gameplay mechanics of the SMT series. Your stat distributions from level ups is obviously important, but at the end of the day, nothing really matters quite as much as your skill setup and party composition. There's no fluff here whatsoever, and it definitely gives the game a lot of focus. Something else that I really like on a purely presentational and aesthetic level is how Nahaobino has access to unique skills through his own essences, much like Nocturne. But outside of that, the whole game kinda just treats you like you're another demon in your party, albeit a special one. While this isn't exactly a thing that's exclusive to Nocturne before SMT5, I mean, like, Digital Devil Saga does a very similar thing. That game has its own feel with what I think is basically like a job system, while SMT5 and SMT3 handle it in a very similar way to each other. The way that the Nahaobino specific essences and the Magatama that you collect as Demi-Fiend both have this very similar feel to each other, and it's just another example of how the two mirror each other. Now, I mentioned earlier how the exploration in this game starts out really strong and then starts to dwindle as you continue, and there is unfortunately another area that I think suffers from this same problem, and that is the game's side quests. These ones are, however, a little bit more spotty. There are some good ones later on, but a good majority of the good ones are all in that first area or two. The obvious standouts for these are the mini bite-sized chaos versus lore dilemmas that you get once per area. I really appreciate how these actually remind me of the early part of SMT1, where you kind of have to choose between Thorman and Goto. It's nice how you get to see the arguments of these two different sides and then kind of decide on which one that you agree with, and kind of do all of that and see the outcome without having to go through 30 to 50 hours of RPG to get there. Outside of these quests, there are a few other fun ones, like the Oni who's trying to force other demons to be his friend, even though he doesn't really know how to, and like those ones I find really endearing. Unfortunately, most of the game's side quests aren't really like that, and they're kind of just either fetch quests or going to fight a mini-boss. And yeah, a lot of them just feel very half-baked, which is a shame since there are side quests in the game that show that there's a lot of potential in what SMT5 could have had, but unfortunately they kind of went for quantity over quality on this one. Okay, boys and girls, it's now story time, which means if you don't want no spoilers, get schmovin'. There was once a young man called Nao Amagi, who was originally named that way as a joke about boys being magical girls, but the player realized soon after that his name was actually a stroke of genius. One day, Nao fell into the ruined demon world and acquired demon powers and started slicing his way through various demons. He then repeated this process until the final act of the game, where he continued to slice through even more demons, as well as gods, because they all wanted to recreate the world in a specific way. The end. Now, does any of this sound familiar to you? Yeah, it probably should, because it's just Nocturne again. Well, for the most part anyway. The difference between recreating a new world and becoming a god to recreate a new world is pretty negligible. Even more so when both games kind of end on you setting off on that path. The biggest change probably being that the equivalent of reasons this time is just back to being tied to the usual alignment system. Hell, both games' true endings, or at least the endings with the most content tied to them, end with a fight against Lucifer where he tests you to see if you're truly ready for what's to come. Little side note, Lucifer refers to this design as his true form. This might be because of what he did during the events of SMT5, but considering the level Lucifer was as an angel, I like to think this is a very intentional choice because it's very reminiscent of like Metatron's design. And stuff like his angelic form in SMT2 is actually just a lie based off human expectations. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a little bit. I am very much aware that the SMT series as a whole prioritizes themes in its stories over characters and arguably the plot itself. And this is what the spin-offs are for, not only to tackle different gameplay styles, but also a shift in tone or method of storytelling as well. Persona is very character-focused, for example, while the Devil Summoner games have a more almost episodic format. So I'm not expecting a mainline series game to have a heavy focus on these characters, but you know what would have been nice? Some sort of focus on them, like, at all? While I do agree that mainline SMT focuses less on these things, I do think that the narrative that these games are entirely devoid of character interaction is very, very silly, and it's something that I think is deeply rooted in the fanbase, having only experienced, you guessed it, Nocturne for a long, long while. SMT3 was the first mainline title to be released in the West, and being the only mainline title we had for 9 years, if we discount Strange Journey and the iOS port for one, just so I can prove a point, that game has been the basis for a lot of fans' perception of what SMT is. And so stuff like SMT4 and Apocalypse release were always kind of seen as the weird ones for their extra focus on the characters. And while Apocalypse is definitely a bit of an outlier, I feel like the way SMT4 handled its story and characters was definitely an evolution of the series, and not an outlier like Apocalypse the way it was kind of treated by a lot of people, at least on release. The lack of character emphasis in the SNES era SMT games I feel are less of an intentional choice and more of a design limitation that Atlus kind of worked around. And while there is this priority on theming, compared to its contemporaries at the time, the game's emphasis on characters isn't really all that lacking. Granted, when you look at like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, sure, maybe not. But compared to stuff like Breath of Fire and the vast majority of RPGs coming out at the time, it certainly wasn't that much lower for the generation. Nocturne, while very sparse with what it does improve on a number of things that the SNES games didn't. Things like having more defined characters and having more individually rooted designs for each one of them. But overall, it definitely maintained its focus on theming and message with the game's story. And so SMT4 continued this on even a little bit more still, the general pattern being as technology improved and what could be done with it, the storytelling and general presentation was made easier, and so every aspect of the game's narrative would increase in scope. Yeah, it's still not the focus, but that doesn't mean we can't have a decent cast of characters that interact with each other while maintaining that usual balance the previous games had. SMT5 breaks that pattern though, and it actually regresses back to something that I think is even worse than how Nocturne handled it. A good majority of the cast feel like they were just kind of made as set dressing and nothing else. Miyazu's presence in the game is practically non-existent to the point where removing her from the game entirely wouldn't impact a single thing, and at that point, what's the point of her even being there? Sayuri, outside of introducing the concept of there being multiple Nahobino, is basically a filler arc that just exists to kill off Tao, who I may add is only killed off so she can become a goddess lady thing, who could also be cut and it wouldn't really affect the plot because all she does is act as a quote-unquote guide, which means she stands with you during cutscenes. The only characters who really matter in the whole game are the free alignment reps and their demon partners, and arguably the other demons of the Bethel Council. And even then, Koshimizu and Dazai are basically just yes men to their respective leaders, although granted that is kind of the point of Dazai's character arc, so he kinda gets a pass, but that doesn't mean I like him. And speaking of Dazai, it sure would have been nice if he shared some of his disproportional amount of screen time around with the rest of the cast, considering Atlus weren't very interested in adding any more in. Him and Abdiel are the only characters in the whole game that actually undergo some sort of an arc, and we actually get to see. Which kinda sucks, because they're lore reps, and lore reps are all trash. Yakumo and Nua, I felt, were the only characters in the entire game that I felt actually had any agency in the story. It's strange how the neutral reps seem to have more independent thought than that of the Chaos ones, despite that being Chaos's whole spiel. It honestly feels like these two could have been main characters, considering their two endings are very reminiscent to Demi-Fiend's Freedom and Demon endings of Nocturne, essentially breaking down to just saying fuck this shit and either trying to preserve the state of mankind as it currently exists, or trying to break the cycle once and for all. Speaking of the endings, something that I did appreciate quite a bit was how several aspects of them have been flipped on their heads a little bit. The Chaos ending, for example, is being fostered by the ambitions of an organization wanting to see order still just one spread out among a wider variety of gods. Meanwhile, the lore ending is being upheld by two people simply acting out on their own and are willing to tarnish the word of the god that they worship just to uphold his will. Which is funny, since they're basically following the might means right rule of Chaos, since they'd just be the ones in charge at that point. In their own ways, they're both bastardization of their alignments, and I think that's a pretty neat thing that they did this time around. And this also sort of applies to the neutral endings as well, both of which are going for the same-ish goal, but one of them goes with the more Nocturne-style rejection ending, whilst the true ending, since this game is more lore-themed, is about accepting the position you are in, and accepting the rules and the laws of the world that you're in, but using that to your advantage. And I think this is perfectly represented with Lucy being a combination of both him and Yahweh now. He hasn't changed his pursuits of freedom and free will, but he has accepted a method which involves using what he would previously be very strongly against. Essentially, one neutral ending is by rejecting both Chaos and Law entirely and going neutral that way, whilst the true neutral ending is by accepting both Chaos and Law and making something in between. Two things that I did really enjoy about the game's writing in general is, one, the flavor dialogue from the demons, and secondly, the bond that the protag and Algami form, despite being a blank slate and a near-emotionless robot. As par course for SMT games at this point, the dialogue for the demons is an absolute treat. Be it negotiations or those few side quests that I like, just mwah, perfect. I can never help but love the sheer unhinged nature of these little bastards, and while underutilized, Gustav and the Memons are really fun additions as well. The Council of Bethel are pretty cool as well, from what little time they have on screen. I think it was pretty fun seeing all of these assholes desperately try and screw each other over the moment the illusion of order vanishes. But yeah, if anybody has any real screen time, it's my homie Algami. It's just simple but fun seeing what is essentially a robot following programming at the start slowly grow a bit of a personality. I'm always a sucker for that type of character. What I quite like about Algami though is that it's pretty subtle with how he goes about it. It's mostly due to how the story's laid out itself, but while he'll straight out say things that show his level of protective instinct in the protag, his demeanor makes it really hard to tell why he's doing it. And it's only really in the true ending where you get to see the demon that this proto-fiend is based off of start to actually shine through. I also just adore how a lot of the early interactions between him and Amano Zako essentially consist of
a dubious little creature getting up to mischief. This is no good. Oh, the beast is demonic in nature. Very icky, no good.
Okay, this is already my longest scripted video, and while I have mentioned a few things on the game's presentation here and there are a few more things I want to say, so we're just going to blitz through this stuff real quick. First of all, I can't work out if SMT5 is either beautiful or ugly as sin. On a technical level, what it's doing is pretty nice. Areas are large and fairly densely packed, and character models for human and demons look very nice. You can really tell that it's had a ton of polish put into its development, especially since apparently the game could have gone gold in Japan a long while before it actually did, but due to the worldwide release they had to wait for the translations to be done. And the reason why you can tell this game is so polished is because it barely feels like this game should be able to run on Switch sometimes. It feels like at one point this game probably ran at like 20 frames per second, but then they kept polishing it and polishing it and polishing it until it got to a fairly decent and playable state. But because of that, it kind of gave me this feeling that it's being held together with duct tape, and while it's working, one bad thing would just make it fall apart completely. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of really smart design choices in here. Things like, in battles, half of the character models that should probably be on screen are deliberately hidden at certain moments when they don't need to be shown. Most of the time you can only see the enemy and the character who is currently acting, and that only changes if you're about to use a support or healing skill, where then you can't see the enemy anymore but you can see the rest of your party. And it's thanks to clever little tricks like this to save on juice, and fun optimization tricks like dynamic resolution, level of detail, etc., that really helps the game just not die. My personal favourite being when Amano Zako is animating at half frame rate and she really looks like a cartoon character. The thing is, while most of the time these solutions do help the game keep going and operating at mostly full power, but there are a few points, as expected, where the game does kind of chug a bit. I never felt like it hindered my enjoyment, but I could definitely feel it, like, the entire time. And certain locales, like the fairy village, for some reason just look kind of awful. Anything beyond 50 meters in front of you just doesn't look like it's rendering in, and I'm not even that sure why. I do hope those supposed data leaks that were found about a PS4 and a PC port coming are real, because it would honestly be really interesting to see just how this would look with everything scaled up and with all of those limitations not needing to be in place. Outside of that though, visually it is really nice seeing full HD renders for every single demon now. While nothing can really beat the artwork for these demons, I do think it's pretty nice having these 3D renders as well. And finally, as for the music, I'm in a little bit of a weird position here, because there is some really great tracks in SMT5, and there's also just a lot of tracks in SMT5. I think having an absolute ton of different battle themes is great, and it like worked for The World Ends With You, and it worked for Persona Q2, and it worked for Strikers if you've got the DLC. But I think the reason why it worked so well for those games is because, for the most part, every single one of those songs is a banger. While in SMT5, they're all pretty, like, none of them are bad, but I wouldn't call all of them bangers. And I think the problem there is that you'll have your favourites, and then you'll just never hear them because there's so many songs in rotation depending on what sort of battle it is, that you just never get to hear what you want to hear. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Battle Seeker, which, so much so, I used it at the start of this video, but I'm pretty sure you get to hear it like 4 or 5 times throughout the entire game. It's not a case of quantity over quality, it's more that the quantity stops you enjoying the quality which is there, because the game only has so much time to let you enjoy something before pulling it away to show you something else. At least in the music department. But yeah, that just about wraps everything up. I realize that this video has probably come off very negative throughout a lot of it. It honestly feels really weird how much I'm talking about all of these bad points of SMT5. It's honestly like it's killed my family or something, but it's weird. At the end of the day, I still really enjoyed my time with SMT5. There's a ton that I appreciate about it. It is, however, just like Nocturne, I needed to get one more in there, in the sense of I don't think I want to play it again, like ever. I might go back and fight Demi-Fiend, but I am not interested in doing a New Game Plus run of any kind for SMT 5. Meanwhile, with something like Soul Hackers and that new announcement, that game's post-game is really eyeing me up at this point. And I definitely have a strong desire to go back to that game over ever going back to SMT 5 or 3. To reuse my SMT 3 food analogy, while Nocturne was a very well prepared but unseasoned steak, SMT 5 feels like the steak 2. They've improved the presentation of it, they've got it on a much nicer plate. And different parts of the meal are pretty much the same, but slightly better in some ways and slightly worse in others. And while I definitely enjoyed it, I feel like something fresher or new would have been much more preferable. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This one was kind of long, so I'll keep this end slate a bit short. Considering at the time of this recording we're nearly at 1,000 subscribers thanks to the Soul Hackers 2 announcement, I'll probably be doing an update video talking about the stuff that I'd usually put here at the end. So do look forward to that in a few days or maybe a week, I don't know. But before I do go, I want to ask, did you like this format a little bit more than my usual SMT videos or not? I find it really hard to be concise a lot of the time, and while I think that is definitely something that I can always keep working on, I do like producing videos that are a bit long in the tooth. But at the same time, I do feel like they're very rambly, especially when I have to be the one who edits them. I don't think any other episode of Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei Game is going to be this long again. I just wanted to try some stuff out, because at the end of the day, I still have no idea what I'm doing. I hit record and start talking, and that is pretty much how it is. But yeah, either way, like, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. See ya.